All right. So, quick introduction of myself. My name is Mariel Beasley. I'm a co-founder of the Common Sense Lab, which is within the Center for Advanced Hindsight, which is within Duke University. So, first a warning. This looks an awful lot like a college seminar classroom. So you should expect some class participation. I will be sort of posing questions back to you all and expect some participation. I'm really good at standing up here awkwardly, waiting for that to happen. So here, basically, we're going to spend the next about 45 minutes talking about human behavior and financial decision making. And really sort of, when we think about financial decision making, a lot of times what we are talking about ultimately is behavior, right? And when we look at and we're going to get a little bit more into what I mean by that, but when we look at sort of the financial health of sort of people across the US today, there's some pretty startling statistics, right? I don't have to tell you guys all these statistics because you're all here at the Hope Global Forum, so you all already understand and care that this is an issue that we need to work on. But just a few examples. The government shutdown has really sort of back in January really kind of brought to light and brought some of into the news a lot around the savings crisis, right? Sort of this inability for about 41% of households to be able to cover a $400 expense without borrowing or selling something. But basically, when we look sort of more broadly at the statistics, about 78% of households in the US are living paycheck to paycheck. 41%, as mentioned, incapable of coming up with $400 for an emergency. 37% are not confident that they have enough money saved for retirement. Even more broadly, the personal savings rate for the bottom 90% is 0%. 40% of people who are 5 to 10 years away from retirement have nothing saved. 7.4 million people are working multiple jobs, which means that they are sort of dealing with multiple streams of income and different hours and all kinds of sort of shifting things that make them particularly vulnerable. 38% of households carry revolving credit card debt, and 1 in 3 households have a debt that's currently in collections. These are pretty alarming statistics. And generally, when we think about the financial state of the world, a lot of times what happens is people say, well, either this is a sufficiency problem, people just don't have enough to get by, they just don't have enough to make ends meet, and there's not much we can do in that because it's just a sufficiency, they just don't have enough. Or the other thing is, oh, well, they just make bad choices. They buy things they don't need to buy. It's sort of on this individual that they have sort of this responsibility in putting their life in sort of this sort of financial precarity. And we say this is, so there's one thing that says this is a huge society problem and there's very little we can do about it without changing everything. Or we say this is the problem of the individual and they just need to make better decisions. Now, the truth is that a lot of this, some of this at least, is a sufficiency problem. There are some households who just don't have enough. But when we talk about 1 in 3 households have debt and collections, that's not a sufficiency problem for everyone. And so part of this is sort of this idea of behavioral science is that there probably is actually some room where some people, we might actually be able to influence decisions if we change the environment that they're operating in just a little bit. And so taking a step away from finances right now, we're going to kind of take a moment to think of our own behavior. How many of you have heard that exercising for 45 minutes at a time, 3 times a week, is good for your health? Okay, so almost everybody's heard this. And like the stats are actually astounding how much it can improve your life by exercising this regularly. How many of you believe this to be true? Most people. How many believe that you personally would be healthier if you exercised more? That's great. How many of you last week exercised for 45 minutes 3 times? This is a fitter group than most. But even still, we see a dramatic reduction, right? We see a dramatic reduction of folks who say, I understand that this exists. I know that this is going to be good for me. I believe it will help me, and yet I'm still not able to actually do it. And exercise is one example, but there's tons of examples, right? How many of us can think about a time in the last month where we ate more than we wanted to? Yeah. Or that we stayed up later than we intended to, watching that Netflix show, hitting to see the next one. Or even looked back at our credit card statement at the end of the month and realized that we spent more than we'd intended to that month. So all of us have these moments where we really want to do something, and in many cases are capable, right? We believe it's true, we know it's important, we want to do it, and yet we fail to follow through on those actions. We fail to actually adhere to these intentions. And in behavioral science, this is a lot of what behavioral science is around, is this idea that we have this intention-action gap. That you can have the full intention to do something, and that does not actually mean that you'll be able to complete that action and do that. And I think this is a really important point, because a lot of times what we see is when we see people not doing something that we think that they can do, and we think that they ought to do, it's because they don't want to. And this is a really clear example to say you can have the full intention, you can care about it, you can believe it, you can know that it's important, and yet you can't quite close that gap. And this is really what behavioral science tries to do. We try to understand, why does this gap exist? Why are intentions not enough? And how can we actually close that gap by redesigning the environment that we're operating in? And that's what we're going to talk about. So I already mentioned a little bit that I'm from Duke University in the Center for Advanced Hindsight. This is us. We're a pretty fun group. And our goal at the center is really how can we make people happier, healthier, and wealthier at home and abroad using behavioral science. And really the reason why we kind of focus on these happier, healthier, and wealthier is because nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I want to be poor, sick, and angry. And yet all the decisions that we make every day are kind of leading us down this path. So this is really kind of where we focus, because we think there's a lot of opportunity. Everybody wants to be stable financially. Everybody wants to be healthy. Everybody wants to be happy. And yet it turns out it's pretty difficult to do on a day-to-day basis. So in 2015, the Common Sense Lab was started in support from the MetLife Foundation. Today we're funded by MetLife and BlackRock to really look at specifically, broadly we talk about wealth, happiness, and health, but really the Common Sense Lab was really focused on low to moderate income households, some of the most financially vulnerable households in the US. How can we sort of change the financial system that people are working in order to increase savings, decrease debt, improve cash flow management, and when appropriate and able, increase earnings. And so really kind of focusing in these key behaviors. So since 2015, since we first started, we have partnered with over 50 financial institutions, banks, credit unions, nonprofits delivering financial services, local governments, universities, anybody who touches somebody's financial life. And together we've run over 60 field experiments to really learn what can we change to move the needle on financial health and well-being. So today, the things that I'm going to cover, which is sort of a quick summary of our learnings, is first, how our brains prevent good behavior. We're not programmed for good behavior, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Then what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how our current financial products fail us. Our current financial products are not actually designed for most of us. And then finally, how could we actually start to design better solutions for better financial outcomes based on what we know about the human brain? So first, how our brains really aren't programmed for good behavior. So kind of going back to undergrad or grad school for some of you, remembering sort of some classic econ theory. So essentially in classic economics, there's been a strong theory that people are rational actors. And what this means is that people are sort of accurately weighing costs and benefits, and they're sort of able to understand probabilities, they're able to sort of project benefits and costs out into the future, take all of that information, all of those sort of calculations, and then be able to sort of make a decision that really maximizes their own well-being, their own utility, and that also, during that process, that their own preferences are stable over time. And this is kind of the classic theory about how people make decisions. And so what that means is that if people aren't making what we think is the right decision, it's simply because they don't have enough information, They haven't actually been told the probabilities of things bad happening, et cetera, et cetera. And so this has been sort of classically the way that we've tried to influence behavior. So what this means is essentially we assume people are making decisions in a vacuum. So if somebody says, you know what, I think I'm going to skip my appointment, we assume that that decision is happening in a vacuum and it is entirely within that person making a decision about the costs and benefits of showing up to that appointment. And so if they don't show up, if they decide that they're going to skip it, what do? We try to give them information about why it's really important that they go. We try to tell them the risks of not going. And we try to sort of project out the probability of something bad happening of them not doing it. We essentially are trying to appeal to this rational actor. We are just giving them more information, expecting that with this information, they're going to make a rational decision. Now, these are in the health space, but we do this also in the financial space, right? So when we think about financial decision making and trying to improve financial behavior, the most common strategy that people are using to try to improve financial behavior is financial education. This is a map of states in the US that have some sort of financial education requirement in high schools. So actually quite a lot. Everywhere you look, there's a financial education, financial literacy course, program, pamphlets. They're literally everywhere you look. There's lots and lots of financial education. And actually, in the early 2000s, the Financial Literacy and Education Commission was established in order to make sort of financial literacy and financial education a national priority. In a given year, $600 to $700 million are spent on financial education, estimated. And yet, remember the stats that I gave at the beginning of this session. Now, it could be that without financial education, it'd be even worse, right? It's possible. But, you know, we're coming from Duke University, so naturally, we and many other sort of scholars around the US ask, well, does it work? If we're spending $600 to $700 million a year on financial education, we should be asking, does this work? Is it actually changing behavior? Is it actually changing people's financial well-being at the end of the day? Not sort of their subjective feelings or their subjective knowledge, but does it actually translate into actual changes in their financial health and well-being? So a few years ago, some researchers from the University of Colorado actually did a meta-analysis. They looked at every study that had been done, every evaluation that had been done on financial education courses, and they sort of were able to compile them all into one and sort of trying to look at what is the effect of financial education on behavior. And what they found is that content-based financial education, so this is sort of that classroom-based, you're coming in, you're learning about financial education, or you know, on a computer screen, but basically learning this sort of content-based financial education accounts for 0.1% in the variance in financial behavior. So not zero, but very close. And what's actually very depressing is that when you look at just people who are low socioeconomic status, it actually is even lower. And when you look at the studies that were rigorously evaluated, with sort of to the gold standard of academic rigor, which is a randomized control trial, you see it is even lower. So essentially what this suggests is that, again, this would be incredibly effective if what people lacked was information. But what this reminds us is that knowing information does not lead to behavior change. Knowing what you can do, can't do, should do, shouldn't do, that alone does not lead to behavior change. And this is something that I say, it immediately resonates with people because we understand this in our own life. There are lots of things we know we should do, but life gets in the way. And this is because we're not making decisions in a vacuum, right? That person thinking, I'm going to miss my appointment. Really, our life is a lot more like this. We are so influenced by what is going on around us that we need to actually take into account what is going on around us if we're trying to influence behavior change. And when we think about sort of our everyday, and this is for people across income levels, almost everything we interact with is asking for our time, attention, and money right now. And so essentially, we are asking people to walk through life constantly saying no. And that's a really hard ask to do. And I think really what this demonstrates is that real people in a real world aren't making decisions in a vacuum, which means that information and the things that they have in their head is much less important than what's going around them. The color doesn't come out, but it's our environment. Our environment really actually shapes our behavior and our choices more than information alone. And our environment is the things that are happening to us every day. So when we think about real people in the real world, these are the things that sort of, there's decades of research in social psychology and experimental economics, judgment and decision making, that sort of show over and over and over again. People are not always this highly rational, calculating costs and benefits. Sure, sometimes we are. Sometimes we are. But a lot of times, what we see over and over again is that our brains are programmed to be hyper-focused on the present. We want immediate gratification right now. We value things that we can touch and feel. If it's concrete, it means more to us. We fail to think about trade-offs. One of my favorite stories in this actually was a few years ago. Our lab went down to a Toyota dealership. And we asked people, by buying a Toyota today, what are you giving up? What do you think people said? The old car. People were like, oh, I'm getting rid of my old car. And we said, so a lot of times what happened is people were like, what do you mean, first of all? Because we naturally don't even think about what we're giving up. And then we say, well, okay, but something has to give. Because you're buying a car today, there's something else you can't do. What is it that you're giving up? And so when we pushed people that way and said, something's got to give. What are you giving up by buying this car today? Then what do people say? The next most common answer, so after nothing, then the next most common answer is a Honda. If I buy a Toyota today, I can't buy a Honda. So ideally, when we think about financial behavior, really what we want people to be doing is thinking about, I'm giving up 3 vacations a year with my family. I'm giving up the likelihood of living in my own house in retirement and instead in my child's basement, right? We'd like them to be thinking across domains. I'm giving up 6,042 lattes over my lifetime. We'd like people to be thinking across domains and also across time frames. But our brains are not built to do that. We naturally create small categories, and we only think about trade-offs within that category. So we think about things that are in the same domain in the same time frame. But when you talk about financial decisions, all you're doing is you're trying to encourage people to think about trade-offs. If you want people to pay down their debt faster, that money's coming from somewhere. If you want people to save for short-term or long-term, that money's coming from somewhere. And so you want them to be thinking about trade-offs. This is opportunity costs. And yet, our brains are actually not programmed to do that very well. We also don't understand probabilities. People are actually terrible at understanding the probability of something. This is why you see, actually one of my favorite stats on this is whether or not you're more likely to die by a shark attack or by parts falling off of an airplane while you're walking down the street. Raise your hand if you think you're more likely to die by a shark attack. Yes. You guys are all like, this is a trick. I know this is a trick. If you think you're more likely to die by a shark attack. Okay, a few of you. This was actually just in the news, right? Somebody just recently died of a shark attack off of Maui. Hope nobody's going to Hawaii soon. Raise your hand if you think it's more likely that you are dying because of parts falling off of an airplane. So the truth is you're actually like more than 10 times more likely to die by parts falling off of an airplane. It's much higher probability. The problem is that we just don't understand probabilities well. We read about something in the newspaper because shark attacks get put in the news. We inflate the probability of that happening, deflate probabilities of other things. Same thing happens with terrorist attacks versus heart disease, right? huge difference, but we feel differently about the probability of that happening to us. Also, we form our preferences in the moment. We think about these stable preferences, and yet people will sort of shift their preferences in the moment, again, based on that environment. And then this last point is that we're cognitive misers. We don't like to expend mental energy. And this means that we use these really quick shortcuts. Think about how paralyzing it would be if you had to actually deliberate on the costs and benefits of every decision you've made today so far. You'd have to basically say, well, my alarm went off. Do I get up or do I not get up? Let me think about the costs and benefits of each of these things. Do I put on these shoes or those shoes? Do I put on that suit or that suit? It would be absolutely debilitating. We make so many decisions every day that our brain has created these shortcuts, these basic heuristics that really drive what we decide to do in any given moment. And that is because it's to allow us to sort of keep that mental energy for other decisions that actually require it. The problem is that we're not very good at sorting out which decisions require it and which ones don't. So this is generally, over and over again, this is what we see about real people in the real world and the way that we make these decisions. A quick example. Imagine that you really like a nice pen. You're a pen connoisseur. And you found this great pen, and it's a good weight, it feels good in your hand, it writes well, and you go to buy it, and it's $15. And you go to check out, and the person says, hey, you seem like a really nice person. I feel like I should tell you that at our sister store, 2 blocks away, they have this exact same pen, color, everything, exact same. It's in stock, and it's on sale for $7. Imagine it's a nice day, you've got time, it's just 2 blocks. How many of you would at least consider walking the 2 blocks to get the $15 pen for $7, to save $8 on that pen? Yeah, a lot of people would be like, yeah, I'd at least consider it. A lot of people are like, yep, I'm out the door, I'm walking. But some people would be like, I'd at least consider it, right? Now imagine instead of being a pen connoisseur, you actually are a suit connoisseur, and you really like a nice suit. And so you find this great looking suit, fits great, doesn't have to be tailored, it's the right color, nice fabric, everything. And it is $1,015. It's a very nice suit. And you go to check out, and the person says at the checkout register, says, you know what, you seem like a really nice person. I feel like I should tell you that at our sister store, 2 stores down, even in the same block, just 2 stores down, they have this exact same suit, same size, same color, everything. It's in stock, and it's on sale for $1,007. Now, how many of you would even consider walking 2 stores down? We've got a couple people who are like, I'm impressed that you're willing to admit it in the group. That's great. So this is a really nice example, because when we think about costs and benefits, in the first scenario, the cost is your time and energy to walk 2 blocks. The benefit is $8 in your savings, in your checking account. Right? And most people say, yeah, that's a great trade-off. Willing to do it. Happy to do it. In the second situation, the costs now are less. It's 2 stores down. It's less time, less of a walk. The benefit, still $8. Your bank account does not care where those $8 came from. It does not care if it came off a pen or off of a suit. But we feel incredibly different. And now, all of a sudden, that cost and benefit trade-off doesn't feel worth it. So this is just a really nice example of how we, even us in this room, our preferences aren't stable. This weighing of costs and benefits isn't actually how we think about a decision. And interestingly enough, we talk a lot about financial inclusion and financial well-being. A lot of times, actually, when you do the same exercise with people who are low income, they are just as likely to walk in both conditions. And one of the reasons for this is because they actually have a little bit more understanding of what is the value of a dollar. They have a little bit more experience, and so they tend to be actually just as likely to walk. And so this is actually one of my sort of side pet peeves is when people say, oh, people are poor because they don't know how to manage their money. People are poor because they make bad decisions. Actually, truth be told, they're actually much better at managing money than most people who have room in their budgets. So that's kind of a side note on my pedestal. So one of the reasons why sort of we feel differently about this is this principle of relativity. This is basic heuristic, this sort of shortcut that we take where we think about that $8 not as $8 in isolation. We're thinking about that $8 in relation to what it's attached to. So whether it's attached to $1,000 or $15, that $8 feels very different. So that's one example of a principle that really influences how we think about and feel about money. The other thing I really want to sort of emphasize is that these biases, these shortcuts that we take, have nothing to do with being smart or not. They have nothing to do with being educated or not. These are sort of fundamental aspects of being human. And one of the parts that I like to, sort of another way I like to emphasize this is Harry Markowitz. Have anybody here heard of Harry Markowitz? He's a Nobel laureate. He's sort of the expert on investing behavior and sort of long-term financial planning. I mean, he knows more than anyone else in the world, right? And this is a quote from him. "I should have computed the historic covariances of the asset classes and drawn an efficient frontier. Instead, I split my contributions 50-50 between bonds and equities." The world expert. He knows exactly what he should do. He actually even knows how to do that, right? And yet even he uses shortcuts and heuristics. Information does not actually change behavior. So this is sort of that very first quick high level. There's PhDs in this first part. You guys got it in 15 minutes. So how our brains prevent good behavior. So now kind of understanding this idea that like our brains are naturally programmed for us to focus on the immediate. We're focused on things we can touch or feel, which is particularly difficult in the financial life. As we get more and more digital with money, it means that savings actually is invisible, right? What we see and what we see from those around us is really consumption behavior, right? We know the cars that our neighbors drive. We have no idea what % they're contributing to their retirement fund. And so what we see, what we feel, what we touch is all consumption. And savings is actually this sort of invisible background, which is just naturally a lot less motivating for us. It just means less to us. It's harder for us to get motivated about it. So these are some of those general brain principles. But so now I'm going to talk a little bit about how our current products fail us. So starting first, and I said I'm going to talk about these things separately. I'm actually going to talk about them together. So FYI. So we're going to kind of start with the product and then how we could design a better solution and then kind of go to another product. So the first one, let's talk about building savings. Savings is generally considered sort of one of the first things that you do for financial health is to create a safety net. Lots of research shows that it's important to have even just a little bit in savings in order to be financially stable. And not only that, it has other psychological benefits. Once you have a little bit in savings, even just a small cushion, there's research that shows that you actually start thinking about yourself differently. You are now somebody who has an asset, and it just changes your own psychology about yourself. So huge benefits to have even just a little bit in savings. So a lot of times this is a focus that people are working on. How do we help people build savings? So how do we do it in the US? What's our most effective savings strategy in the US? 401k. So real estate, I'm going to ignore that one for now. 401k. I've got the mic, so I get to do that. So 401k, right? Most effective savings product we have in the US. And specifically with the 401k, the biggest thing to impact America's savings balance for retirement savings, it moved us basically from 34% of people who had access to a 401k to 90%. And what is that? Automatic enrollment. This is the shift from opt-in to opt-out, right? So, and this is sort of many, many companies, not all of them still in the US, but many, many companies have switched to this automatic enrollment that basically says, hey, if you do nothing, you're saving. And it used to be if you do nothing, you get nothing. And this is really related to this principle of default bias. And this is that so defaults are incredibly powerful to sort of dictate and mandate our behavior. And this is because people use the most automatic option, that path that is right ahead of us, to avoid particularly to avoid complex decisions. There's a couple of different ways defaults work, and so some people try to use defaults because of limited attention, where they trick people into things. How many of you have a subscription that you never actually remember signing up for? So that's one way defaults are used. That's a bad way defaults are used, right? So for everybody in this room, I hope that that's never a strategy you have for using a default, is to trick people into it. Defaults are really about creating an easier process for a complex decision. And this is the thing, is that retirement savings is an incredibly complex decision. It's hard to know what vehicle should I be saving in. It's hard to know how much should I be saving. How much is going to be enough? It's actually a really, really complicated decision. And when something is really complex and complicated, what do? We procrastinate. So oftentimes, the best way to get somebody to not do something is to tell them, this is an incredibly important decision. It has a huge impact on your future. It's really important you make the right decision here. Here's a whole lot of information about it. Tell me what you want to do. Essentially, it makes us feel like we never have enough to be able to make that decision, and we worry about making the wrong decision. That fear paralyzes us, and so then we stick with the default, which in many cases is nothing. Retirement savings has changed that on its head, where now the default is that now that you save. Unfortunately, I think the estimates are now over 40 million working Americans don't have access to a 401k savings program. This is changing in lots of places, but by and large, this is a wonderful savings vehicle that is not offered to many people. So how do we do it in short-term savings, though? We don't have anything similar to short-term savings. The closest thing we have is getting people to set up automatic transfers. So this is a screenshot from a bank that will not be named. And basically, if you wanted to set up an automatic transfer, essentially, you have to choose your frequency. You can choose it to be just a one-time. You can have it be daily. You can have it be weekly, every 2 weeks, twice a month, last Friday of every month, monthly. There's no guide for which is the right choice. It's already complex. There's a general rule of thumb that you should align it with payment, right? Great, I'll align it with income. What happens if I'm paid irregularly? What happens if I'm a gig worker and that sometimes I make a lot of money on a Monday, and then 2 weeks I won't have any income, and then I'll make some income on a Thursday because I'm contract? This doesn't solve for that challenge for me. Similarly, you have to set a set amount. What if, even if I know that my payday is every other Friday, what if my hours vary significantly? And I don't know if this paycheck I'll be able to save $50 or not. This actually is a fine designed system for a banker. This is a fine designed system for a Duke University employee, because I get paid the exact same amount on the exact same day every month. But when we think a lot of people who are financially struggling, that's not their financial reality. And in fact, these options to even do every 2 weeks and twice a month and last Friday of the month, those are really recent additions into these sort of options, and like within the last less than 2 years, I'd guess. And so this is a really fine solution for people who have a lot of time at a computer where they can actually go on and do this, because it requires a lot of effort to find the right page and set it up. It's fine for people with a good ability to predict the timing of their income, and fine for people who have a really good ability to predict the size of that income. Unfortunately, that's not most US households. And in fact, just thinking about freelancers as just one example, in 2017, it was estimated that there are about 57.3 million freelancers in the US. And it's predicted that about 58% of workers will have some sort of contract job by 2027. So this is going to be increasingly less and less effective of a good product design for most working people. Because this is not easy. So how could we redesign savings, knowing that it's important to make it easy for people because they have limited time and attention, and that we need to make it attractive for people sort of in the short term? So we did a project. The first thing that we would do is we would say, let's reduce friction cost to actually sign up to do this. Let's make that process as smooth and easy and automatic as possible. This is sort of like the creating of defaults, right? Let's also use mental accounting. People already naturally think about money in different ways. I talked about how it's hard for us to think about trade-offs because we're already naturally bucketing money. This also means that we think about money differently depending on where it's coming and where it's going. And so money that comes in the same cadence as our paycheck gets spent at the same cadence of our paycheck. But money that comes differently, we can think about differently. And let's also use pre-commitment. Knowing that we're incredibly tempted in the here and now, we have limited self-control, we're much more happy to commit our future self to doing something painful. How many of you have ever just said, I'm going to start exercising next week? The exercise plan starts on the 1st of next month. You actually see, everybody knows sort of about New Year's Day, the gym, right? Huge, that's when sign-ups happen. But actually, you can see it pretty smaller bumps on the 1st of every month. It's like a natural start time for people. But that's because people are basically kind of committing their future self to do something and saying, not today, but when would be a good day? Maybe the 1st of the following month. So if we can actually get people to pre-commit to a good behavior, then we might be able to get them to actually follow through a little bit better. So we actually tested this with a company called Digit. How many of you are familiar with Digit? A few? So Digit is it's an automated savings tool, and it's SMS-based. And what happens is that every day, they have an algorithm that predicts how much money extra you have in your account. And every day it moves a little bit of that over into a savings account. Some days it's $1, some days it's $7. And so that they have a sort of this predictive algorithm to figure out when you're not going to miss that money. And they also have guaranteed if you overdraft twice that they'll cover those overdrafts based on them moving money. If you continue to overdraft beyond that, this is probably not a good product for you. But basically, it's very nice. They're able to kind of do all of this manually. And so we said, well, this is great. It's a great product. But there's also sometimes where we could actually get people to be active savers, right? So this is all a passive savings process. Could we get people to be active savers with a stream of money that doesn't come with the paycheck? And when we think about low-income households in the US, what might that be? Tax refund. So for a lot of households, the tax refund is the largest check they'll receive all year. And the nice thing about it is because it doesn't come as part of a paycheck, people tend to think about it a little bit differently. Some people use it to pay down extra on their bills or to catch up on late bills. Some people use it to put a down payment on a car. Some people use it for all kinds of different things, but generally people think about it and spend it differently. And so we thought, what if we could just capture some of that to go into short-term savings? So essentially what we did is for one group of people, we sort of took a random selection of folks, and for some of them, when Digit detected a deposit from the federal government during tax season, they sent this text message to them. Hi, Mariel. You got a federal tax refund this year. What % would you like to save? One thing to note first, we didn't ask, do you want to save, right? It's already implied. There's a social proof implicit sort of recommendation here that you're going to save something. So what % would you like to save? So that's what we sent to some of them. But thinking back on this idea of pre-commitment, and we're a little bit more, we know that in the moment we're tempted. Can we actually, does it make a difference if we ask people before they're tempted? So for some people, we actually sent in sort of late January, so before people were really receiving refunds, and said, hi, Mariel, you might get a federal tax refund this year, because we didn't know at that point if they were going to get one or not. If you do get one, what % would you like to save? Now, people sort of aren't, the idea is like they don't have the money in hand yet. They might actually be a little bit more optimistic about what they're going to do with it. So raise your hand if you think more people were willing to save if they received it when the refund was in hand. Raise your hand. A couple of people. Okay. Raise your hand if you think more people were willing to save if they got it before their refund. More people. Raise your hand if you didn't vote. A few of you. So actually, those who didn't vote, I'm going to shoot myself in the foot right now. You guys are right. Actually, it's the same between the two conditions, which is very nice, actually. 10% of people basically wanted to save something above 0, which is great. Turns out if you just ask people if they want to actually save, and we'll make it really easy because we'll move the money over for you, 10% say, yeah, that'd be great, actually. Do that for me. So one is just ask, make it easier. The real difference between the two conditions is how much they were willing to save. And what we found is that when they were asked after they had the windfall in hand, they were willing to save about 17% on average of their tax refund. When they were asked before it was in hand, it was 27% on average. So 10 percentage points more. And when we think about the average check of a refund is over $2,000, 27% of that is actually, that hits your $400 mark. So this is actually incredibly exciting finding. And of course, the next question should be like, okay, great, but what happened the day after? I get it, but like, you know, I've made commitments to go to the gym, and then Monday comes and I still don't go to the gym, right? The nice thing is that Digit could actually move the money automatically. And once the money was moved, it was pretty sticky. I mean, it was easy for people to get it back. All they had to do was send a text message to say, put this much money back in my checking, and Digit would just move it over automatically. But because it now was in that mental bucket, we didn't touch it. And essentially what we found is that 3 months later, 80% of the savings was still there, which is pretty exciting. So this is sort of an example of how you could redesign a savings product in order to better account. You're aligning it to when income's coming in, you're getting people to pre-commit to saving to it, and you're sort of making that attractive by asking them before they're too tempted in the moment. So another example. How do we currently manage cash flow in the US? How do we try to tell people to manage their cash flow? Well, so we tell them to like cover through borrowing and things like that. But if somebody's like, oh, you know, I'm just having a really hard time figuring it out, the first thing we tell everybody to do is create a budget, right? We say, you got to create a budget. We're going to figure out your inflows and outflows, and you know, we get them signed up for something like Mint or any other PFM that basically shows all the places you're spending if you have any digital accounts. And Mint actually has a huge number of people that sign up. They link their accounts. They look at this, they go like this, and then they never log in again. And part of this is because what is this doing? It's just reminding you that you're hemorrhaging money. It's telling you everything that happened in the past. It's not being very helpful about how to manage it in the future. And that's a challenge with budgets, right? So budgets is difficult because it's trying to predict things that are pretty difficult to predict. And oftentimes it's doing them on a schedule that might not actually be the right schedule for people. So if we were going to redesign budgeting, what would we do? Well, the first thing we would do is we would think about the timing of a budget to create better anchors. So anchors is this idea that a number or a figure actually holds an incredible amount of value for us, even if it's not related at all, and then we adjust from that number. So one of these early studies on this idea of anchoring was that the researchers had people write down the last 2 digits of their social security number, just the last 2 digits. Write down the last 2 digits of their social security number, put a $sign in front of it, and then said, okay, now we're going to do an unrelated task. Here's a bottle of wine. I want you to tell me how much you think this bottle of wine is worth. Okay. People who had a higher last 2 digits of their social security number, like 7, 8, thought that that bottle of wine was worth significantly more than people whose last 2 digits of their social security number were much smaller, by chance. And this is because we can't help but anchor on numbers and then adjust from there. When we think about budgets, you're essentially creating anchors for people. You say, this is how much you spent on grocery shopping. And at the beginning of the month, you think, man, I got a lot of money to spend on groceries this month. By the time you get to the end of the month, now all of a sudden, you're at a much smaller number, and oftentimes you've overspent at that point. And this is because the cadence that we have, we're giving people a monthly anchor, but people aren't shopping for groceries once a month. And so that number is actually not a good anchor, because that's the number they're thinking about, or even subconsciously anchored on, when they're actually in the store doing their grocery shopping at the beginning of the month. So we did a project with Propel. Are any of you familiar with Propel or Fresh EBT? So they are a fintech company that specifically looks at how to, basically they are synced with EBT cards, so electronic benefit transfer cards, and they allow people to look at and check their balances on their EBT card, particularly for SNAP, for food assistance. And it also gives them sort of a record of their transactions. And the reason why they did this is because they found that people, it's very difficult actually to know how much you have left in your SNAP account. And so you had to either call the number on the back of the card, which is a little bit of a hassle, it's a little friction. All of us hate doing those things. Or you could go into a store and make a small purchase, and then it would tell you how much you had left on your receipt. So what they found is people were going in and making these small purchases just to check their balance. So they created this to allow people to sort of more easily check their balance in the same way that anybody can with their bank account. And so one of the things that we first found, though, when looking at Propel and working with them with their data, what we found is that people spent 80% of their benefit, their food benefit, their SNAP benefit, in the first 9 days of the month. 80%. So basically, right, and we said ideally it would sort of stretch for the entire month. It might not be a perfectly even line, right, because you might want people to buy in bulk a little bit at the beginning, but the actual budget, as you can see, dips dramatically. Early, right? And then people are sort of trying to peter it out towards the end of the month. There's lots of other research that shows that actually the further you are away from your SNAP disbursement day, the worse you do on tests at school. So kids are actually running out of food by spending early. And there's a whole other debate about just, again, sufficiency. There are some issues around sufficiency. But there's also we believe there's some room to help deal with this. And one of the challenges we think is that people are anchored on this larger number amount at the beginning of the month. So what we did is SNAP just has a digital overlay. We couldn't change policy. That's a lot of work to try to change how SNAP benefits actually get dispersed. But what we could do is we could actually just change the display screen. So what we did is we just took their total monthly amount and just divided it by 4. It wasn't dynamic. It didn't adjust based on their actual spending. We literally just tried to give them a more relevant anchor, which was a weekly budget, because that's actually the cadence that people are spending on groceries, or much closer to the normal cadence. And so as you can see, we gave sort of, instead of telling them their full balance, they could still sort of see what their full balance was as they clicked to click in, but we just gave them sort of a different number to anchor on. Again, no change to the actual policy, no change to the actual disbursement schedule. All we did is change the very first number that they anchored on. And what did we find? We found that actually they were able to stretch their benefits for 2 additional days. That's additional 6 meals for a family. simply by just changing that. And we actually followed up with a lot of other kind of surveys to make sure that it wasn't because people were going hungry earlier in the month, because that's not the solution either. And what we found is actually they weren't compromising nutritional value to stretch those benefits an additional 2 days. So let me check time. Oh, we are over. So, so we have lots more examples. I'm not going to go through this one. But basically, the kind of end rules for this as we think about how to design for human behavior is one is pay attention to defaults. What is the default? What's the easiest path in front of people? Do you have it sort of laid out easy for people to make the right decision? The second one, again, is related to this. If you can't change the defaults, can you at least make the right choice the easy choice? And if you can't, can you at least make the wrong choice harder? Yep. And then the third one is, again, we really value things we can touch and see and feel. And so making sure that you're demonstrating and showing people in their peer group who are doing it right. Again, it's really important that it's somebody in their peer group that's part of their social group that they identify with. And so with that, I'm done.